So let's take a look at part 2 of our emotion unit. Philosophy is the finding of bad reasons for which we believe on instinct. Okay, so I said I was going to introduce this to you guys in this unit, that can emotion stand in the way of us acquiring knowledge? We're going to analyze how that works. And I think the answer is yes, but we're going to kind of analyze how. By doing that, we're going to actually take a look at the other 3 ways of knowing that we've already examined. So for example, with perception, okay? Can our perception of things actually change by the emotional state in which we're in, especially strong emotions, right? So like you've heard expressions like love is blind and fear has many eyes, but that's sort of tying together an emotional state with a perceptive state. So I think you could make arguments that things like if you're in love with someone, say you're really in love with someone, you might, when you look at that person, see nothing but amazing qualities, right? Beautiful hair, right? Wonderful physique, fantastic voice, like their voice is wonderful. Then let's say you go through a really rough breakup with that person. Now, for some reason, all you see in that person is their flaws. Look at that big pimple on his chin. Like, what a horrible pimple, right? And his breath stinks. And he has the squeakiest of voices. Can that actually be a change in your perception based on your emotional state? Or is it really something else going on there? But that's maybe one way you could look at it, is that maybe strong emotions influence our actual perception. Second way of knowing we looked at, reason, or actually that was our first way, could also be influenced maybe by emotion, right? Now think of this like a scientist who comes up with a hypothesis on a particular subject. And someone goes to try to disprove their hypothesis. Scientists are often very emotionally attached to their hypotheses and their theories, and they might actually feel that emotional attitude that they don't want someone to try to disprove their theory. Okay, they might lead to this sort of, my theory is right, emotional state, where they will emotionally argue in favor of their theory, even though their reason might be wrong. They won't listen to reason, you've probably heard that expression, because they're too emotionally invested in perhaps something like their theory. Okay, and then language. Obviously, emotion creeps into language. We've used the term emotive language, right? Again, you may think of people like who said you've probably been in so-called rational discussions and so-called irrational discussions. Or when you get into, say, really heated arguments, it's really operating on an emotional level, where things like swearing start happening and insults start happening. That is a very emotional type argument that really is being driven by said emotion, which is really influencing your language at that point, right? The language you're using is being definitely influenced by emotion. So in this way, you could argue that if we just focus on the other 3 ways of knowing, yes, emotion could actually be a hindrance to us knowing things. That emotion could be a filter that's really diffusing knowledge from getting to us. Okay, so what I'm going to now talk about is something called, which you've heard before, rationalizations. So rationalizations, in my definition, is how we sort of reason through our pre-existing prejudices, okay? Especially when we have emotional states that are fairly strong. And I'm going to show an example in an Aesop fable, okay? So then I'll have you guys pick apart the fable as to where this is occurring. So a famished fox saw some clusters of ripe black grapes hanging from a trestled vine. She resorted to all her tricks to get at them, but wearied herself in vain, for she could not reach them. At last she turned away, hiding her disappointment and saying, "Ah, the grapes are sour and not as ripe as I thought." So, did the fox want the grapes? Yes. The fox could not get the grapes. She tried, but she could not get that which she wanted. Her conclusion to this effort was, the grapes are sour and not as ripe as I thought. Now, how would the fox know that? The fox wouldn't know that, right? Because the fox never got the grapes. So why is the fox saying that in this fable? To make herself feel better, that's right. And that's what I would call a rationalization. She's rationalizing this to herself to try and change her emotional state. Okay? Which implies that we can manufacture bad reasons to help solve emotional distress. And according to psychologists, this is incredibly common in humans, that we are often creating rationalizations to just our emotional states. So I'm going to use a cigarette smoker as an example. If any of you are cigarette smokers and you feel offended, I apologize. But here's what I'm going to say about that. So you smoke cigarettes, right? So let's say you smoke cigarettes, and you know, as most of us do, that cigarettes are going to be bad for your health. I don't think there is a smoker that doesn't know that smoking cigarettes is bad for their health. So this is a conflict, right? You are smoking, and you know you're doing something bad for your health. That conflict will make you feel tense because you know you're doing something bad for yourself. And we don't want to feel tension. We don't want this to occur. So how can we alleviate that tension? Well, the easy way would be we could just give up smoking. We could go, you know what? I don't like this tension that I'm feeling bad. So I'm going to accept that, yes, this is bad for me, and I'm just going to stop smoking. That will then alleviate my tension. But that's not always the case, the way people resolve this part here. What's another way they could resolve that tension? Well, they could question whether, in fact, smoking is bad for their health. They could go, you know what? I'm not going to give up on this part. I'm going to give up on this part. I'm going to say, you know what? I don't accept your reasons. I don't know if smoking is really that bad for me. I'm kind of a healthy person. I don't think it's as bad as you think. It's not going to be a big deal. And therefore, you are continuing to smoke, because really that's the only two options. Either you still smoke or you don't smoke. So either way, you probably want to reduce this. And so how do we do that, right? Now, questioning the evidence might even be, the word question might even be, could be replaced with the word ignoring the evidence. You could basically turn a blind eye to the evidence and go, yeah, I know I smoke, but don't talk to me about the bad health stuff. I don't want to look at that picture on the package of the cigarettes. It will help alleviate your tension so that you can get to the same sort of way you're, to the behavior. But what you're doing there is what's called a rationalization, right? This is a rationalization to continue the behavior for which you know causes you tension. Okay. Now, this can also create cycles within us, right? It can lead to sort of this self-confirming belief system, okay? So, for example, you can have a powerful emotion on something, okay, which could affect your perception, right? So, like, for example, say you fall in love with someone, very powerful emotion. That will affect your perception, as we said before. Like, you will see all their good qualities, you will hear things that, you will even smell things that make it reaffirm this. This will also lead to fallacious reading. Let's say you fall in someone who is actually not a nice person. Let's say it's an abusive person. So let's say a man falls in love with a woman who actually is very abusive to him, physically and mentally. But he sees nothing but good qualities in this woman. And so therefore, when he's confronted by his friends and they say, why are you going out with that girl? She's so bad for you. He will construct rationalizations as to why that's happening. And that will actually lead to emotive language. The language he'll use in describing the girl will be, no, 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 she's not as bad as you thought. She's a wonderful person. You just don't see it. You don't see what I see. She's got great qualities. You will actually start using language to affect that rationalization. And believe it or not, that language will actually help drive your emotions more. You will start to believe your own reasoning, and you will start to hear yourself in your own language, therefore creating a cycle here of reinforcement. Now, I use kind of a negative example, but we could also apply this in a positive way, right? You believe in something like a certain type of right, certain rights, right? Like, say, women's rights, and that will affect your perception. So you're always seeing news stories about women's rights. And it will allow you to create, now maybe in this case I shouldn't use the word fallacious reasoning, right? But it will help you reason, and therefore you'll talk about it in a way that's very positive, and that will just keep reinforcing that upon yourself, okay? So this can be a negative spiral, but it can also be a positive spiral. So when I go back here to something like a rationalization, it could also be applied emotionally to like a very positive thing as well. Okay, so I don't want to imply that this is always a negative thing, but it's that negative thing that we're focusing on today, in the sense that can emotion stand in the way of your knowledge, right? So here I'm presenting kind of a model where it could possibly be doing just that. Okay, so here's an example. Imagine Henry has a prejudice against immigrants, right? He is against immigrants. So it could lead to the following, could. His perception could be biased. When he's out in the world, all he notices is immigrants who are lazy. He just sees them all over the place. And he doesn't see these incredibly hardworking immigrants all over the place. He just biasly perceives the ones that he sees as lazy because of his pre-existing prejudice. As well, he uses fallacious reasoning. He will, for example, make hasty generalizations. You may recall we talked about that as one of our fallacies, right? From his own limited experience. And his language might reflect this. He uses words like, I don't know, the immigrants don't know the meaning of hard work, right? His language reflects his emotional state based on a pre-existing prejudice, okay? These reinforce themselves, right? The original prejudice is reinforced by these types of things, making it difficult for Henry to be objective. In other words, Henry is not open to new knowledge about immigrants because of his emotional state that's creating a barrier for that new knowledge. Now, he can escape from the circle, absolutely. But in order to do that, he has to question his pre-existing prejudices, okay? This is a big point here in TOK I'm trying to get across. It seems like in TOK we're always asking questions, like as if we're not looking for answers. But the idea of asking questions might actually affect something within you that will open you up to new knowledge. By asking the question, it may open a door that you didn't realize was there and let new knowledge through. Maybe a way you could think of it. Okay. Now, a fanatic, by definition, will refuse to question assumptions or consider evidence, right? If you are fanatical about something, you will absolutely not question anything, right? So here's what a psychologist says. A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree, he turns away. Show him facts or figures, he questions your sources. Appeal to logic, and he fails to see your point. We've all experienced the futility of trying to change a strong conviction, especially if the convicted person has some investment in his belief. We are familiar with the variety of ingenious defenses with which people protect their convictions, managing to keep them unscathed through the most devastating attacks. So again, this psychologist is pointing out something as well that we're seeing here, that once you lock into something, it's often an emotional stand that you're taking that might prevent you from changing your mind, so to speak. You guys know what the word axiom means? If I had to have you define the word axiom, how would you define it? Okay, they don't know what an axiom is. An axiom is a starting point. Maybe you could think of it as a building block, right? Like it's the point at which things are built up from. Next year in the grade 12 course, we'll talk about axioms in various subject areas, like the axioms of mathematics, right? If you talk to, say, your math teachers today and you ask them what the mathematical axioms are, they might be able to point some of them out to you, right? And other things like that. For example, maybe things in natural science, an axiom might be something like the scientific method is an axiom. Okay, so what is irrational behavior? So emotions for sure distort beliefs and can lead us to poor decisions, right? But these short-sighted emotions can actually create long-term consequences, right, as well. So emotional states can lead to big consequences. And think about that yourself. Have you ever said something when you were really angry that you immediately regretted and maybe led to some big consequence down the line, right? I mean, like the first time my daughter swore in front of me, I'm sure she regretted that, and it kind of made a big deal, right? So Aristotle, the philosopher, defined man as a rational animal, and in economics, okay, which I know some of you are studying, is based on the assumption that we are all producers and consumers, that we are all rational people. Economics is based on that, this idea that people will, there's supply and demand, and that we are rational people that will perform rational operations. I mean, that whole field is based on that. So here's a description about this. How should we conceptualize this rational, this is an economics example, consumer, who all of us know and who some of us are, who with self-disgust grinds his cigarettes down the disposal, swearing this time that he will never again risk orphaning his children with lung cancer, and is on the street 3 hours later looking for a store that's still open to buy cigarettes, who eats a high-calorie lunch knowing he's going to regret that high-calorie lunch, but does not regret it, and can't understand how he lost control. He resolves to compensate by eating a low-calorie dinner and eats a high-calorie dinner instead, knowing he'll regret it. But he doesn't regret it. And instead he sits gluing to the TV, knowing that again tomorrow he'll wake again in a cold sweat, unprepared for the morning meeting on which much of his career depends. This describes a lot of people in the world. That they know that a lot of the things they're doing is wrong, and they're doing it anyways. I know I shouldn't have stopped for a double this morning coffee, because I probably had too much coffee already in my thermos. I did it anyways, right? Tonight I'm taking my wife and my mother out for dinner, and I'm probably going to order something really high calorie, even though I'm probably supposed to go to the gym tomorrow. I know I'm doing stuff that's bad for me, but I'm doing it anyways, okay? And that, as you relate it to economics, you think about that. You're setting up a system in economics knowing, well, let's make healthy food because people should choose healthy food because that makes sense. Why would they choose? And yet they're choosing the unhealthy food, right? People aren't necessarily working in a rational way that we can predict. And it's tricky then. How do you set up a system based on a so-called rational person when most of us act irrationally? This suggests that we are masters of acting against our own best interests and making resolutions that we break the first time we get tempted, okay? Emotions maybe can distort our ability to think clearly and behave intelligently. Maybe emotions are the problem, is what I'm saying. Maybe. That's the point of my presentation today, is emotions could be the big problem. So what happens if we didn't have them? If we took emotions off the table? Well, this has been explored before. Okay? There was actually a group of philosophers known as the Stoics who attempted to just do that. And they invented the word apathy as a state of mind literally without passion, where the mind could mirror reality purely through reason and through perception and essentially eliminate emotion whatsoever. A science fiction example would be, for those of you who maybe have seen Star Trek, right? The so-called Spock character has supposedly cleansed himself of all emotions. Therefore, it is not going to stand in the way. Okay? But this is a philosophy point that humans have come up with as well. This was where the science fiction came from, right? Is this idea that the Stoics could do this. Now the question is, can you do this? Can you eliminate emotion from your decision-making process, from your knowledge acquisition process? Is it even possible? And again, I have no answer for you. I'm just here to pose